everyone. This is The Crime Cafe, your podcasting source of great crime, suspense, and thriller writing. I'm your host, Debbi Mack. Before I bring on my guest, I'll just remind you that The Crime Cafe has 2 ebooks for sale, the 9-book box set and the short story anthology. You can find the buy links for both on my website, debbimack.com, under the Crime Cafe link. You can also get a free copy of either book if you become a Patreon supporter. You'll get that and much more if you support the podcast on Patreon, along with our eternal gratitude for doing so. But first, let me put in a good word for Blueberry Podcasting. I'm a Blueberry affiliate, but that's not the only reason I'm telling you this. I've been using Blueberry Podcasting as my hosting service for my podcast for years, and it's one of the best decisions I ever made. They give great customer service. You're in complete control of your own podcast. You can run it from your own website, and it just takes a lot of the work out of podcasting for me. I find for that reason that it's a company that I can get behind 100% and say, you should try this. Try Blueberry. It doesn't require a long-term contract, and it's just a great company, period. And it also has free technical support by email, video, and phone, so you can get a human being there. Isn't that nice? Hi, everyone. Today it's my pleasure to have with me an author who writes about a bohemian woman with a mission in Paris during the 1920s. Her protagonist is Kiki Button, and her latest novel is Autumn Leaves. Along with her fiction, she writes poetry and reviews. I'm pleased to introduce Tessa Lunney here today. Hi, Tessa. Thanks for being with
Hi,
us
Debbie.
today.
Oh, it's a
Hi.
pleasure.
Wonderful to have you on. Thank you for being here. And I loved your book, by the way. I still have to
Oh,
review it.
thank
I
you.
feel real bad about that, but it was a very enjoyable book. Tell us about Kiki Button and your series.
Yeah, sure. So Kiki Button, the book is set in the early 1920s in Paris. So the first book was April in Paris, 1921, and the second book is Autumn Leaves, 1922. Kiki Button is an Australian expat. She was a nurse in the Great War, but doesn't want to live in Australia anymore. She wants a life of greater freedom, adventure, and fun, really. So she runs away back to Paris, which she had come to know during the war. In Paris, she meets up with the friends that she'd made during that time, friends from Australia, such as Maisie, who was another nurse, as well as friends from the British Army, such as Bertie. When she's in Paris, she works as a gossip columnist for a London magazine, reporting on all the fabulous celebrity and aristocratic goss that was going on in Paris at the time. But secretly, she is also a very reluctant but very capable spy. She had been recruited during the war by her arch nemesis, the nefarious head surgeon, Dr. Fox. And Dr. Fox finds her again after the war. He's still working for the British government, and he's going to make sure that Kiki works for him. So that's who Kiki is. She's a very lively, vibrant person who is also quite straightforward about the problems that she carries with her from the war and from what she did and how that affects her day-to-day life. She's enormous fun to write. And sometimes I feel that she just writes herself, like I can hear her speaking in my head.
That's wonderful.
Especially her clothes. Yeah, it is. It's good fun. Especially her clothes and her shoes and her parties. These are super, super great. So the series has 2 books in it at the moment, and the first one is when she arrives first back in Paris after deciding she wants to leave Australia. The second one is when she returns to Paris after being in Australia for a year after the death of her mother. So they're sort of different in tone. She's still the same vibrant woman, but the first one is just pure joy, and the second one is a little deeper, a little heavier. I think of them as in the sort of Paris book subgenre, if you know what I mean. So they're sort of mystery spy thriller. I call them a sexy spy thriller set in the 1920s. But there's also a lot of romance, and there's also a lot of Paris in them. Even though she does go to London and she does go to Rome and she does go to other places, Paris is the city of her heart, and the books really focus on it as a place as it might have been in the 1920s, especially in expat Montparnasse.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the excuse me, with the job you did describing the ambiance of Paris in the 1920s. How much research did that require?
A lot, a lot, but I did it out of pure joy. In 2008, I read a book called Among the Bohemians by Virginia Nicholson. Virginia Nicholson is Virginia Woolf's grandniece, Vanessa Bell's granddaughter, and her book Among the Bohemians, Experiments in Living 1900 to 1939. This book, actually, here we are for your YouTube people.
Love that cover.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's a yeah, it's beautiful. And um, what it is about bohemian life in England, particularly London, in the first part of the 20th century, but not the talking about these people's work, but talking about their life, how being bohemian was a whole of life exercise. And so the chapters are on money, food, clothes, how to bring up children, travel, parties. And I was really looking for a template for how to, not just how to write as a skill, but how to create a life where writing could be at its heart, however successful or not that I was. And this was like a template, like a guide, like a Bible. It showed all these people in London, some I'd heard of, like Virginia Woolf, but lots that just failed really in their artistic endeavors, but lived so gloriously. And in the process of their living, really contributed a lot to the way art was made and the way we thought about, especially women and art and what women's work was. So this started my obsession with the 1920s. So even though it covers a much larger period, the 1920s was a real boom time after the war. And so I just went through her backlist, and I started reading her backlist, and I read her book again, and I read more of her backlist, and I've read The Great Gatsby, of course,
Oh,
maybe
yes.
10 times. This is my very old copy. I refuse to read another edition, even though there are
That's
millions, but I need
awesome. Look at
this
that
picture.
thing.
I know George Hoyning and Huner, sorry, George Hoyning and Huner. So the picture's from 1930, but it is beautiful. And then I found A Movable Feast by Hemingway,
Nice.
and I've read that one multiple times. So when I was writing the first one, I'd already been reading about the 1920s for about a decade. I'd completed a doctorate in war fiction as well. So when I was too tired to read about battles or war trauma, I'd read about the 1920s because it had so much post-war information, I guess. And but it was a little bit lighter, a little bit more fun. So yeah, I'd been reading for about a decade, and then when I started writing, I had a lot of the information already, and then I just had to do very particular bits of research. There's a in the Sorry, for the second one I had to do more research, partly because I didn't know what was happening precisely in 1922, but also because I have attached the main plot point to something that's happening politically in Europe at that time, and it was quite an unstable time after the war, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, the German Empire had collapsed, the Russian Empire has ceased to exist, and it was Bolshevik Russia and a civil war, the tail end of the Civil War. So I also had to do research around what was happening politically in Europe around then, and so I could tie that into the spy plot. But it
That's
was fun.
fascinating.
I mean, so much fun to read about that time. So exciting.
Oh my gosh, yes. Wow. Was there anything in particular that inspired you to create this particular protagonist in this situation?
Not one thing. It was lots of things, lots of things. So I was, as I said, I completed a doctorate in war fiction, which had a basis in trauma theory, and I read a lot about war trauma. And after I completed that, I really wanted to write something a bit lighter, a bit more fun, not completely away from the war trauma idea, but away from the war. So that was one thing. Another thing was that I was pregnant when I wrote the first one, and I was reading a lot of crime because I was pregnant and a lot of romance. And I wanted something that had a little less violence than in it than most crime because I was so, pregnant and very sensitive to what was going on. Uh, and I wanted a really strong female protagonist because I knew I was having a girl and it was really making a difference to me, especially, the dead girl is a strong idea in crime fiction, but I was finding it really difficult to deal with a lot of dead girls in book after book after book after book when I was a woman giving birth to someone who was going to become a woman. I'm like, so I did it partly for that and partly because I wanted to live again in the 1920s. It's my fantasy holiday destination. But I read history after history and book after book, and it sort of felt like I was looking through the window at a party and I could see everyone having a great time, but I couldn't get in. But if I wrote myself into it, I could invite myself into the party. Uh, and it worked. It really worked.
That
And
is so
then
cool.
there's so yeah,
It is.
yeah, it's really fun. And there's so many, as when I started researching, there's so many really fun, great women who are not as big names as the men. They're not as big as Picasso, or Man Ray, but Lee Miller is really great, and Nancy Cunard, and Australian artist Stella Bowen, and Catherine Mansfield, who's from New Zealand. So I also wanted to spend some time with these women and create a woman who might talk to these women. Um, talk to these women in a more intimate way.
That's wonderful. I love strong female protagonists, so great,
Me too.
great stuff. Especially ones that go on adventures like yours has.
Yeah,
Uh,
cool.
what are your plans for the series? Do you have a certain number of books that you'd like to write?
Um, yes, but as you know, with publishing, it's a very adventurous path. I would. So the first one's 1921, the second one's 1922. If the ride continues, it would go through every year up to the end of the 1920s. She would be based in Paris, exploring the political and cultural upheavals uh, of the time. So, for example, in 1923 in Germany, there was a communist uprising at the same time. The Nazis had the beer hall putsch and tried to take over the Weimar Republic. So that's pretty exciting for spy work. And then, for example, in 1925, Josephine Baker arrives in Paris and sets Paris ablaze with her review. And so that is a huge cultural moment of reckoning, especially with France's, African empire, like the French Empire that in Africa that still existed. So there's a lot to do with that. And then she'd take a break and then come back in the 30s to the beginning of the Second World War and deal more specifically with the Nazis and maybe Britain's not Britain's ties with Nazi Germany, but the way that um, a lot of powerful Britons. There was a powerful minority of Britons who had a lot of fascist leanings, and to deal with that. So that would be my plan for the series. But it's really also to use her to explore bigger ideas from our contemporary world, like how to be a modern woman, how to create a life for oneself as a woman that's really honest, especially in a framework that is maybe not very flexible. And not very flexible in terms of what women were allowed to do and what they were expected to do. And even though we have much more flexibility now, I was surprised / shocked how many of her questions were not that far from where I am now. In fact, the 1920s don't feel that far from where we are now, sometimes politically,
Yeah.
sometimes culturally, in terms of of what women are expected and are allowed to do legally. It feels 100 miles away, because certainly in France at that time, women didn't have the vote, and that's not the case. France, that's not the case in France anymore, or Britain, Australia, America. Australia had a marriage bar for women working. If you got married, you weren't allowed to work. So obviously, there's so much has changed, but there are sort of the fine-grained details of what it means to be a woman creating her own life. That there's a lot of resonances, because she was a pioneer, and that was when women were starting to look at those, like really strongly look at those issues, and then how that resonates 100 years later.
I think more and more we're seeing stories structured with women as active narrative drivers than we have in the past. And I think that's a good thing.
Me too.
Absolutely.
I'm pouring myself a little
cup of tea. All
Cup of
right.
tea.
Have a cuppa. Which writers inspire you most? I get a feeling I know, but go ahead and tell us. And what do you read for pleasure?
I read a lot of spy thrillers set in Paris.
Imagine.
Imagine that. I actually I feel I have quite wide reading tastes. So I've shown you some of the books here: Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Among the Bohemians. This one, which, as you can see, it's got all my little notes in it: Paris Between the Wars, Art, Style and Glamour in the Crazy Years by Vincent Bouvet and Gérard Durozoy. That's a non-fiction book full of beautiful, beautiful illustrations. So what inspires me? Yeah, I would say I have quite wide reading tastes. I've read a lot of war fiction, and my doctorate was actually on Australian war fiction, so I read a lot of Australian fiction and continue to read a lot of literary fiction. I read a lot of crime, but I particularly like historical crime, so set in the first half of the 20th century, and also crime writers from that time, such as Simenon, Georges Simenon. I read Alan First at the moment. That's who I'm loving, with his spy thrillers set in that period, 37 to 42, in Paris or around Paris. And there's so much Paris in his books, and the characters are all in love with that city, and that makes me in love with his writing. And I love Le Carré. I've read all of the Bernie Gunther series by I've read all of the Bernie Gunther series by Philip Kerr. In the middle of the night, I tend to read Georgette Heyer romances when I've got both of my daughters and I'm trying to get them to sleep. It keeps me awake. I read Australian crime writers like Peter Temple. He's phenomenal crime writer. But then I do read a lot of non-fiction. I'm reading East West Street by Philippe Sands at the moment, and a lot of history about that period, World War One, interwar Europe, World War Two. Then I read like Australian writers like Tara June Winch. I read last year. Who else did I read a lot of literary fiction, and I like Virginia Woolf, and I've tried to read more classics. I mean, I just read everything I possibly can, to be honest.
I know the feeling. I like reading a variety of things myself.
Oh, poetry. I've been reading more poetry.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I should read more poetry, because there's some really good stuff out there. You should
read more poetry. Yeah. Well, I mean, things like the Poetry Foundation and the Paris Review both have a daily poem email. So I've also So sometimes I don't sit down with a book of poetry, although things like Blood Axe books that do these great compendiums, Being Alive, Staying Alive, they're phenomenal for short contemporary poetry. But those daily emails means that you can just open your email and there's a poem there every day. And some won't really resonate, but others are just like, how do you know? How do you know? That's exactly what it feels like in that moment. And they're like a little gift, a little
Yeah.
gift. Uh, and I love it. And I read a lot of literary journals like the Paris Review. There's an Australian one called Heat, Canadian one called Brick, McSweeney's as well, that have short fiction and essays and poems and reviews. And that's also a really great way to see what other people are doing and what other people are writing, because when you like a thing, you can just go deep and read everything. But I do love to go deep, but I love to be broad as well. I like to mix it up, broad, deep, broad, deep. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do I read? What am I inspired by? This one was inspired by the journey that this book sent me on.
You have really got me
But
intrigued about that book. I got to read it now.
I think so. I recommend it to everybody. Is this? I have two copies: a lending copy and a I call it my Bible copy, the copy that doesn't leave the house. So I always have it available. It's nonfiction, so
That's
yeah,
a
but it's so.
non-circulating book there.
This is a non-circulating book. The other one is actually in circulation. So it's nonfiction, and it's just very tender, witty, lyrical, and very personal, because she knew these people. They were her grandmother's friends, her father's friends. So that makes it really a special book.
Fantastic. Sounds wonderful. What advice would you give to someone who'd like to have a writing career?
Keep reading and start writing.
Yeah, just start, right?
Yeah, it sounds very simple, and in some ways it is, and the complications come when you're trying to push the book from your idea through to a manuscript you can shop around, and then the process of publication. But the act of writing is that conversation that we have with each other as readers, is to join the conversation, the reading conversation, by creating your own text and putting it out there. And in some ways that's quite straightforward. You have something that you need to say, and you write it down, and then you put it out there and see what happens. Yeah. And then as you go on your journey doing that, you might find that you need to go one way or the other way. I did a master's of creative writing and then a doctorate of creative arts, because I loved that structure, and because doing the degrees also gave me a legitimacy as I was starting out. I've got homework to do, I've got assignments to do, I've got a supervisor to meet, so I could create a really strong practice. As the structure of study meant that was something everybody could understand. And so within that I could create a practice. It wasn't just me being selfish. I need to write. You're not a writer. But it's like, I need to study. Oh, well, you are enrolled in a degree. So that helped me a lot. But other people are not helped by the structure of study. It's not what they want to do. It's not how they work. Or maybe they don't have time, or they don't have the money. So it's not the cheapest way to learn how to write. So however it works for you, but just keep reading and then join the conversation with your work.
Yes, good advice there, joining the conversation. I like that. I'm really impressed not only with your education, but the bibliography that you put together on your website. All those books, the fiction, the nonfiction, very nice.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, that's what helped me. Of course, there are more books, more books that are I've read that I could put up, but they were the most helpful. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I'd love people to read those writers as well.
Well, it's
Yeah, I mean,
fantastic.
it's as I said, it's part of the conversation. So if you're not reading, you're not really you're not really part of what's going on. That's how I feel anyway. And that's how I feel with the writing. It's not just I have something to say, it's more that I have something to contribute to what other people are saying.
That's
Mm,
great. That's exactly the right attitude, in my opinion. It's just,
thank you.
get out there and talk about it and share and exchange stories. Great stuff.
Mm.
Um, is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish up? Anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I was going to just add one thing in terms of people who are beginning their writing journey. I find the most useful skill that I have developed through my study, and I was forced to develop it through my study, is how to critique your own work. It is extremely difficult to learn how to edit and critique your own work. Is this good writing? Does this work? Does the character come off the page? And I'm still learning. I wouldn't say I've got it, but but it's the skill that is most invaluable. And so, however you want to create that skill, however you manage to do it, I would say that's the thing to hold on to because that's the thing that will push you forward as a writer. Uh, Other things that I might want to say to wrap up. Um, I hope you read my book.
Very cool.
And get into the 1920s and all the fabulous writers and all the fabulous women who made extraordinary lives and did amazing things in that time. I've mentioned a few in my books, but there are so many, and there are so many from countries that, like, there are a lot from Britain and America, but I'm Australian and there were Australians there. There were New Zealanders there, South Africans, Vietnamese, Algerians, Moroccans, Senegalese, I mean, phenomenal number of people there. So go and explore.
Yeah. Well, it's fantastic history-wise and fiction-wise. So thank
Oh,
you
thank you.
very, very much for being here today to
Thank you,
talk
Debbie.
about your work. It's been wonderful. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, it's
And
lovely to talk to you too.
thank you. But before we go, I just want to remind everybody who's listening or watching to please leave a review if you enjoyed the show. Also, for what it's worth, my books are half off on Smashwords, all of them, until January 1st, 2023. May as well get used to saying that number, huh? 2023. Including the Crime Cafe box set and short story anthology. Those two books are among the perks I offer on Patreon to my supporters. So check out our Patreon page, please. This is our final show for 2022. So our first guest for the new year will be Lynn Slaughter. Until then, happy holidays, happy new year, and happy reading.